Hey, let's go ahead and get started. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Expert. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have almost 40 years of experience as an NIH applicant, intramural researcher, staff writer, and now as a full-time NIH grant mentor. I've helped clients land nearly 600 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your NIH grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. Particularly if you're I live in New England and we're in the middle of an ice storm. So I have hot beverages all over my desk right now and a very warm coat. So if you're attending live, you're on listen only mode. You can start putting questions in the Q&A box. If you go down to your toolbar, there's a Q&A box and you can just start typing them in now. This is going to be a pure Q&A session, no mini tutorial today. And if you're watching this as a recording, either on the course dashboard or on our open YouTube channel in the future, just a disclaimer that we're recording this on January 7th, 2026, and everything that we discussed today is true to the best of my knowledge, but things change fast in NIH, so always check out the website and speak with a program officer to make sure that it's still accurate. What you should be viewing in the library right now, it really depends on whether you're targeting a cycle 1 or a cycle 2 deadline. So given that it's January 7th, some of you are targeting a February 5th deadline or February 12th if it's a K or February 16th for R21, R03, or the resubmission deadlines in March. If that's the case, hopefully you're not watching anything in the library. Hopefully you're iterating drafts with your team and polishing the narrative and maybe watching checklists to avoid top mistakes. But mostly at this point, I hope that you're done with your most of your drafting and that you're iterating the draft with your teammates and colleagues and working with your pre-award support office to gather the last of your information. If that's not true for you, don't panic. That is an aspirational timeline, and many people can be successful on shorter timelines than that. For those of you who are on the ball and getting ready to apply for a June or July deadline, which is cycle 2, hopefully you're watching chapter 1 of the relevant writing course, whether that's Master the R series or Master the K series. Of course, you're able to get a hold of program officers now. So, hopefully, as we're coming back from the holidays and there is no longer a government shutdown, you'll be able to get a hold of a program officer to answer your questions. So, any NIH updates, they have released the common forms, and you will be expected to write your biosketch using the new common forms. So, from what I understand from a colleague, they are very glitchy at the moment. So, I would not rush to do it just yet. Maybe give it a week or so to kind of hopefully they'll iron out some of the kinks. The program keeps crashing from what I understand. It's been somewhat problematic. But for any upcoming deadlines, for deadlines on or after January 25th, which is any upcoming deadline, because there's nothing between now and then, you will be expected to create your biosketch using the common forms and using Science CV. What else? NIH updates. The a high court of circuit appeals, I think it's called. I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me if I got that wrong. Has said that it is not legal for NIH to unilaterally impose a 15% cap. They cannot unilaterally impose any cap on the FNA. So that is I'm sure that we've won a battle. We haven't necessarily won the war, but it's tentatively good information. Okay, so I am gonna open up my Q&A box. I see people are starting to load it up with questions. Go ahead and feel free to put a bunch of questions in there. Oh, I should also say another update to the library. Just a couple of things having to do with your membership. So everybody on this call, who is on this call live, has a membership to our virtual courses and live events. So the next first Fridays, which is my virtual office hours where you can just drop in and ask me submission specific questions. That is an event that is not recorded. Other attendees will hear what you say, but it's not recorded. It's not released anywhere. It's not on a course dashboard or on a YouTube channel. So you can come and I enable your speaking function on the Zoom call, and we can talk through your submission specific questions. I usually do that on the first Friday of every month. The first Friday of this month was January 2nd. So we moved it to this Friday, January 9th. So if you do have to register for that separately. Once you register, you're registered for the series, but you're not automatically registered through your membership. So if you would like to sign up for First Fridays, whether you can attend or not, I think Riley beat me to the punch and has already put the sign up link. She knew where I was headed with this. Yeah, First Friday's registration link, she jumped the gun. She was way ahead of me, is in the dashboard and I mean in the chat function. And the next boot camp is going to be on Tuesday, February 17th, will be the first of 4 consecutive Tuesdays where I do a live stream boot camp. So basically that is, it starts at noon Eastern time on Tuesday, February 17th. And it lasts for like an hour and a half to 2 hours each week. And basically what we do is I present one chapter of Master the R series and field questions and give you homework. And then you come back the following week having tried to do some of the homework with any questions you have about troubleshooting you may need help with in getting some of the homework done. So that starts on February 17th. You also need to register for that separately for each event. So Riley, if you could put the sign up for that, she's already in there. So she's got the sign up link for boot camp in there as well. So those are the next 2 live events. So this Friday and February 17th for the boot camp. And I just recorded updates to the Human Subjects Forum and to Master the K series. So literally on Monday, I recorded those. So it looks like my team is zipping through that update. So I would imagine that that will easily be available to you in your dashboard, probably easily by the end of January. Okay, so I had one emailed question and I see people are putting questions in the Q&A. Regarding K99, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Regarding K99R00, how can I determine whether preliminary data are allowed, required? They are, period, the end, they are. I believe it used to be that the early K99R00 discouraged preliminary data, but the parent application allowed it. I can't find any recent guidance on this. No. It's always been that you have had to include preliminary data on a K99R00 for sure. I can't remember. I mean, I've been working on grant applications since 2007, full time, and prior to that as well, just not full time. And I can't remember an instance or a NOFA where it was true that you didn't need preliminary data on a K99. For sure, you need it. I've never seen one that I can recall that did not require it for sure. So obviously on any career development award, any mentored K career development award, there's going to be some aspect of what you propose where you don't have expertise. That's the whole point of the mechanism. But contrary to popular belief, you actually pretty much on any K, you're going to have preliminary data and at least a first author publication in the field in which you're proposing to get training. And that training, if you're doing a K that where you name a primary mentor, you have to have a publication with the primary mentor in the field in which you're proposing. So if anybody knows of anything different, like I've been doing this a long time, but that doesn't mean that I know everything about NIH. So I always ask people in the audience if they have any other experience where that's concerned. But I can't remember in all I've worked on probably a handful of K99s every year since 2007, and I can't remember ever seeing a NOFO that said no preliminary data. So for whatever that's worth, that is the case. You need preliminary data and you need a publication with your mentor in the field in which you're proposing, a first author publication. Okay, NIH likes the real world applications using existing technologies or the development of novel technologies. Both, actually. So, I mean, they routinely fund both of those things. So, depending on what you're doing, you might be targeting different institutes in those instances, right? So if you're developing a novel technology, you may be looking at applying to NIBIB. That might be the right institute. But if it's an existing technology and it's you're applying it to some sort of novel application, then you typically go to the disease specific institute. So, but yeah, they routinely fund both of those things. Does preliminary data mean the data collection or experimental results? So preliminary data are preliminary data, just, like it's data you have collected in that field, right? So for a typical R01, some of those data are typically published and much of it is not yet published. So preliminary data have already been collected. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you're distinguishing between those two things, preliminary data um, or experimental results. Those are used interchangeably at NIH. Data collection is like a description of the methods. So I'm not sure if I'm not understanding what you're asking. Please clarify. But preliminary data and experimental results tend to be the same thing. So preliminary data are a type of experimental results that supports the rationale of the study design. And in the case of like an R01, it could be published or not published, but much of it should be not published at the R01 level. And actually, we're actually writing a newsletter tip on this right now because we get so many questions about preliminary data and whether or not you're allowed to use other people's preliminary data. Can you use published preliminary data? And the answer is all of these are okay in theory, as long as the bulk of what you're using as preliminary data or experimental results to support the rationale for the project that you're proposing is work your lab has done, and much of it is unpublished. So just something to consider. And this person is saying raw data versus analysis results. I would talk to your mentor about that because I'm if the raw data are just numbers that aren't terribly meaningful without analysis, then like I'm answering this question in a vacuum and I'm not a subject matter expert. So if the raw data don't really, if you can present data that even if if the sample size is not large enough to be statistically significant, but somebody who has some sort of reasonable scientific background can look at the data and say, yes, these data appear to support the person's hypothesis. They appear to support the rationale for the project. That's fair game for preliminary data. If it's a lot of, I don't know, a lot of numerical data that mean nothing without analysis, then that's not going to be helpful for you. So I don't know if that clarifies it, but I hope that I'm understanding what you're asking. So anyway, let me know if I can clarify that in some way. I had a person who emailed me a lengthy question that boils down to they were assigned to the study section they didn't want. So this is a group with whom I had been working, and they keep getting routed to a study section that they've gone to in the past, and they've been really unhappy with the outcome. They don't feel that it's the appropriate study section, and they haven't been getting good reviews there. And this is not an uncommon problem. So um, I'll back up and say that my initial suggestion to them was when they were choosing a study section on this particular application is to make sure they're making the request in the assignment request form. And also in the assignment request form, there's an open response where you can give the rationale for why you want this study section. And there you could say, we feel this is the most appropriate study section because of X, Y, and Z. It fits our project for the following reasons. You could also say, we don't want to be routed to this other study section. We feel that one's a bad fit because of X, Y, and Z. That's what these folks did. And in their instance, it still didn't work. So what do you do at this point? Their question is, can I switch my study section after assignment? I have never seen that happen. They could have a conversation with the program officer about it, but in my experience, once you're assigned to the study section, you're kind of locked into that study section. So at that point, I'm going to respond to them via email, but in case they're on this call, I'll let you know that, and for your edification, what I am going to suggest to them is that they really study the roster and the types of expertise represented on the study section roster, and try to be able to articulate why it is that this study section doesn't appear to have the expertise to get a fair and impartial review. That's always the phrase you want to use, to get a fair and impartial review. And the reason that I say this is that you do have the opportunity. This is not written anywhere on any site, CSR, NIH. I've never seen it anywhere. But you can contact the program officer, not the program officer, the SRO, scientific review officer, who runs the study section meeting. And you could tell them that I've been assigned to your study section. And we feel, looking at the roster, we feel that in order to get a fair and impartial review, we would need this XYZ additional expertise represented on the panel. Are you willing to add that expertise via ad hoc member? So you can't request a specific reviewer, obviously, but you can request specific types of expertise. And the phrase that you want to use is, in order to get a fair and impartial review, we would need XYZ expertise represented on the panel. Is there any way to add that via ad hoc member, and see if the SRO is willing to do that? You want to do that as soon as you can, because they need time to make that happen, to identify a reviewer, invite them, and get them the information. So beyond that, there's not a lot that can be done. I've said many times during the Q&A that I've never seen a rebuttal work. If an applicant feels that they haven't had a fair review, I've never seen a rebuttal work. They're rarely done. And I don't know, maybe somebody out there has heard of a successful one. I've never heard of one. So anyway, that's kind of the last course of action that they have, and to ask the program officer if there's any way to switch, but I've never seen that happen either, to switch after assignment. Okay, what are your thoughts for R03 proposals based on secondary data analysis for publicly available data? I think that's a great idea. So that is one of the uses of the R03 mechanism. So a couple of thoughts about that. So the R03 is expressly designed for this purpose. I mean, it can be used in other ways as well, but one of the main purposes of the parent R03 is for secondary data analysis. And when it's used as in that purpose, it's one of the few times where it is sometimes not followed up with an R01. It's sometimes just a standalone grant. You do the secondary data analysis, and that's fine. So what you want to make sure is that your target institute either participates in the parent R03, or if they don't, that they sponsor their own, or that even if they participate in the parent and sponsor their own, check to see if there's one that they, like sometimes really large institutes will sponsor their own R03 specifically for secondary data analysis. So it's a little tricky to identify the right institute and the right mechanism, because some institutes don't do R03s. But yeah, the R03 is perfect for that. In terms of publicly available data, the only thing that I can think of that is sometimes problematic with that is that when you're filling out the human subjects form, you have to um, because the information was collected not under an IRB of yours, this is already existing data, you have to figure out if NIH considers it human subjects research. And there's a flow chart for that. If you would like the URL for that, let me know and I'll drop it in the chat. It's readily available in my courses. I think I talk about it in chapter 4 of Master the R series, but I can find it easily if you want me to drop it in the chat. And the other thing is, if it is a human subjects course, a human subjects project, that when you get to section 3 and you have to fill out the enrollment report, um, there's if you're dealing with a publicly accessible database and the data exist, but you do not have them, you estimate the enrollment data, and then for actual put 0 and then update it after you have access to the database in case you don't yet have access to the database. So those are like the only quirks that I can think of with using publicly available data. But yeah, secondary data analysis of publicly available data, no, shouldn't be any problem as long as you can identify an appropriate NOFO for it. And if you have other specific questions about that, let me know. Oh, and then this person is asking, this may be somebody else, but it's a related question. Can we claim existing secondary data as preliminary data? You know, I've seen people use all kinds of things as preliminary data. The thing is, it can't be like the backbone of your R01. I've seen applications where people have used another person's publication as preliminary data to support the rationale for something that was particularly risky and outside the box. The trick is that can't, like, the bulk of what you are using as preliminary data has to be your team's primary data that they've collected, some of which can be published, but most of which should not be. But yeah, I find that NIH's definition of preliminary data to support the rationale of a proposed project is pretty broad, and the requirement pretty staggering. So people tend to kind of throw in everything but the kitchen sink. If you are submitting an R01, how many published papers do you need in a specific area of your proposal? I'm laughing because I get this question at least twice a month. For context, I'm a public health researcher focusing on populations facing financial scarcity, but I am submitting an R01 looking at time scarcity and time spent in work. So I wish I could give you an answer and just say, this is what you need. This is the number. This is the magic number to hit. And NIH many years ago, like 15 years ago, they did have a range that they put on the website, but it did not stay up very long because I'm sure that people had an issue with it. So what I will say is that your best bet is to talk to a mentor and/or a program officer about this, because different fields have different requirements, and I'm always kind of shocked at how broad the range can be. So, for example, I had a friend who was a biostatistician who was, she was writing 1 and 2 author papers and cranking out like 15 of them a year. And yet, like, when I was a bench scientist, I was doing very expensive wet lab animal research, and it was slow and time consuming and very expensive. So the papers were fewer. And the other thing it will depend in part on your field and what is required in your field and what would be considered appropriate in your field. It also matters whether it's a high impact journal or not, because if you have like one, paper in a high impact journal, it might be the equivalent of several papers in a low impact journal. It depends on where you are whether you're first, last author, or middle author. Um, and it depends on your study section to a certain extent. So, some study sections will, and even when things are assigned to the same study section in consecutive years, I've seen reviewers have kind of different responses to the level of productivity that an applicant has. So I would talk to I'm assuming this you're a first time R01 applicant. I would talk to a mentor or a team member with more experience. I'm hoping that as a first time applicant that you have access to somebody with more experience who's giving you some guidance about this and see what they say. But ultimately it's a little bit like writing your first R01 is a little bit like throwing pasta at the wall to see what sticks. This is an iterative, with apologies to my Neapolitan grandmother for saying that. She would never have thrown pasta at the wall. But I'll say that grant writing is iterative, and you can talk something to death and really kind of like try to game the system. And ultimately, there are a lot of answers you're not going to have until you just put the application in and see how they react to it. And so if you're kind of on the fence about whether to do it, you may want to think about, like, if you have ESI status, when your ESI status expires, how to fit in multiple applications in your ESI status, and just put it in and see how they react, see how a study section reacts to it. Most people are not funded on their first R01 application. Some are. I don't want, and you should always write them as if it's your only shot at funding. You always have to write them as if it's your only shot at funding. But statistically, most people don't get funded on their first R01 application. And part of it is you just have to get yourself in the game. You just got to start applying. And, the first one's always the hardest, and just see how they react. So, I think there was another question below this that was cleared. I don't know if it was a question or a comment, but I already addressed the one that's there, Riley. Was there another one that was below that? Let me look at the answered list. Okay, does anybody else have other questions? We have a large but silent group today. I think people are a little shell-shocked. So, while I'm waiting to see if people have more questions, I'll just reiterate that this Friday at 11:30 Eastern Time, I am doing virtual office hours. The sign up is in the chat, and I'll do another Q&A session on January 21st, 2 weeks from today, which is Wednesday, and that will be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And then on February 17th, I'll do the first of 4 consecutive weeks that are the live stream boot camp, which is my live presentation of Master the R series, where I answer questions and give up-to-date information. And the sign up for that is in the chat as well. I'll keep looking for updates to the human subjects form and Master the Case series, because those are in process. So if that is relevant for you, please check that out. So does anybody have any questions? I'm going to stay on for one more minute, but I'm not getting, no question is dumb, just so people know. Is the new NIH biosketch site working well now in storing files? Nope. It did not work well for me this morning. Pages would not load. Yep. Nope. Are you surprised that it's a shit show, this launch? No, right? None of us are surprised. No, it's not working well. I've only heard bad things about it. So your experience is consistent with everybody else's experience. It's freezing, it's crashing, it's giving erroneous messages. It's not working well. And if given that it's the 7th and we have a couple of weeks until the first set of deadlines start to roll around, I think I would just step away from it for a week and wait. We are doing a tutorial on the form on, geez, when is it? Let me see. February 4th, we're going to do a mini tutorial on using the form, and hopefully it'll be working by then. I know that it doesn't help people too much who are applying for the February 5th deadline, but that's the earliest we can fit it in. So no, it's not working for anybody right now. Okay, we got a bunch more questions. Last year, I submitted my R01. I'm planning now to submit for a research article with the data, submit a research article with the data from the R01. Do you think this might negatively impact the review of my R01? No. So, no, I don't think so. And if your R01 is not funded, so it's very typical that if you have as I just said, the first R01 is rarely funded. If this R01 is not funded and you're in a position where you have to resubmit it, either as an A1 or um, I don't know if this one was a first submission or not, but um, it's not at all typical that it takes at least 9 months to get the answer back on your funding, often longer because you get caught up in budget crises and political nonsense. So it can take longer to get an answer. So of course, by the time your application is reviewed, you're in a different place with the project if you've used other sources of funding to advance the project. So if that were to happen, like an R01 has a broad project scope. So I'm assuming that, if you have a publication, it's not going to be a publication that covers all of your aims. Maybe it covers a portion of one of your aims. That's not uncommon for that to happen. And if that were to happen and you got funded, you could talk to the program officer about slightly shifting the project scope so that you could look at, either broaden one of the aims or go a little bit further with the final aim with your budget. But yeah, it's not at all uncommon. And in fact, what you may want to do, it's much more likely that your reviewers are not going to buy the feasibility. They are so astonishingly risk averse that having a publication almost always helps your cause. So if you have it in time, I would submit it as post-submission material. You can update that information up until 30 days before your study section meets. So I wouldn't worry about it. I'm sure it's not a publication that covers the whole project because it's an R01. So yeah, I think that'll be fine. What are the major sections of an NIH R01 proposal? Okay, great question. I'm sure and I should say we have a lot of new people, a lot of new members. So this is something that is probably relevant to a lot of people on the call. So right now, the major subsections of an R01 are significance, innovation, and approach. That's it. There's nothing below approach. So sometimes, and by convention, most people label them A, significance, B, innovation, C, approach. I don't know why. It doesn't really correspond to anything in the instructions, but that is the convention at the moment. I often see people then go on to say D, timeline, E, data analysis. There's nothing past approach. Everything else is a subheader under approach. So yeah, those are the three main subheaders. And of course, significance and innovation now correspond to factor one, importance of the research under the new scoring criteria that went into effect last year, and approach corresponds to factor two, which is the feasibility of the research. Okay, let's see. Do you have any sense of how NIH would view papers submitted for conference presentations? I presented at a conference in the summer for which we had to complete and upload a manuscript. This rough draft manuscript is still uploaded and publicly available. If you want to expand on the data and results presented there, would the paper be considered as a positive or a negative for an R01? Positive. For sure. So, of course, like a conference paper is not going to have the same weight as, like a peer-reviewed paper in a manuscript. But yeah, I mean, I don't know why unless I'm missing something, I'm not sure why people are asking me questions about negatively impacting review on an R01 because I I hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of summary statements that I've read have said we don't there's not enough data, not enough publications. We don't believe the feasibility. There's not enough here to rationalize. I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've seen a reviewer say, "You've already done too much of this. Like this is too far along." Um, Reviewers have an insatiable appetite for preliminary data and publications at the R01 level. It is insatiable. It's staggering the amount of info. I mean, and I've heard people say, like it's almost like they want the whole damn project done before. I'm cursing a lot on this on this session. It must be because we're starting a new year, but yeah, it's like they. I've heard people say that it seems like they almost want the project done before they will actually fund it. So I can't see why it would negatively impact. Like if you have a three aim R01, you're going to have a ton of data for aim one, typically, including some publications. And with the PI as first or last author, usually last author at that level. And then you're going to have some preliminary data for aim two, like a fair amount of preliminary data for aim two, and then the least for aim three, but typically you have preliminary data for aim three as well. So I'm surprised that I'm getting so many questions about like, is it bad to have publications, conference papers? Like, is it too much data? Like, rest assured that the answer is virtually never that you have too much data and that the project is too far along. That's almost never going to be the case. But again, like these can be very nuanced situations. So if you have a mentor with whom you can review this information, go ahead and do that. But I rarely see that happen. So yeah, I would say it's typically a positive. Okay, let's see. Regarding the Science CV system, our grants office just circulated the following communication received from NCBI, who is sponsoring this platform. We apologize for current problems affecting Science CV, and we are actively working to resolve the issue. We hope to have this resolved as soon as possible. Please try again later. Thank you for your patience and understanding, NCBI, NLM, NIH. Yeah, so if you can, I'd give them a week to get their acts together. It's a new launch, and NIH is just chaotic as hell right now. So I would give them some time, and I appreciate the person who sent that along. So yeah, that's consistent with everything I'm hearing. Are the preliminary data requirement different for R03? Oh, yes. R21 and R03, the preliminary data requirement is much less than on an R01. So there are NOFOs that say that preliminary data are not required but allowed. That's not true. In practice, that is simply not true. You do have to have preliminary data for both of those mechanisms, but nowhere near the level of what you need at an R01. And in fact, that's often the decision between whether or not to apply for an R01 or a small format R like an R21 or R03 is you're not going to be competitive at the R01 level because you simply don't have enough data. So if you are in a time crunch and you need to get your hands on some money to move a project along, like quickly, you can't fuss with this for 2 or 3 years to figure out how to get an R01. And you're not sure you have enough data. I usually suggest that people do a small format or an R21 or R03 because the requirement for preliminary data is so much lower on those mechanisms. Yeah, for sure. Virtually every mechanism at NIH requires data with the exception of the cats. That's the one where you literally are not allowed to report preliminary data. But in actual experience, people usually have data. They simply don't report them on the cats. That is almost always the case in the applicants I've worked with. But in practice, all of these mechanisms that say data are acceptable but not required. Like you're allowed to submit preliminary data, but it's not required. It's required. Just it's always going to be required. I've heard of exactly one applicant in all my years of doing this who got a summary statement where they said you weren't supposed to submit preliminary data on this R21, but it was a specific NOFO. And even in that instance, I was like, really? Like I'm sure there were others who submitted preliminary data. So, but yeah, it's a much lower requirement for the small format R. I believe I saw an email yesterday stating that NIH has 20,000 proposals to review. I think it was 23,000 actually, and they are behind because of the government shutdown. So my question is, how much time is spent by reviewers actually reviewing on average a proposal? If they're so behind, what is a reasonable expectation that a proposal would be thoroughly reviewed? Wow, what a great question. So, and I'm remiss in not repeating this information because we have so many new members on. But this was a notice that came out, I want to say at the end of November, where NIH spelled out how they were going to handle this. And I think we have it in a blog post on my website, on the homepage of my website. But I think the number was 23,000 applications were affected by the government shutdown. And as a result, for the next two cycles, so for cycle one and cycle two, meaning the February, March, and June, July deadlines, NIH was going to alter the way they reviewed. So instead of having the bottom half triaged where they're not discussed at the study section and the top half discussed at the study state section with lengthy comments from the reviewers, they were going to divide it into three. So the bottom third was not going to be discussed and was triaged. And they had labels for these, but I don't offhand remember what they are. The middle third was also like more meritorious, but also not discussed. And then the top third would be discussed, and the summary statement would be truncated. There would be a shorter written information. I think there's like the summary of the discussion will not be there, but the comments from the three assigned reviewers will be. That's my recollection of what they were going to do. So they're reducing the burden by instead of having reviewers discuss half of them, they're discussing a third of them, and then the written feedback is shorter. I'm bummed about this because I have a lot of first-time applicants going in these two cycles, and man, the summary statement is just, like crucial to their ability to revise and resubmit. So it's kind of a bummer. My suggestion in this scenario is to have a conversation with your program officer ahead of your submission to alert them to the fact that you're really concerned about this and you're really hoping that they'll sit in on the summaries, the study section meeting and take notes so that you can get more substantive feedback about how the review went. I was initially concerned about the issue with the possibility of virtual review because of having to like reschedule people. And I did get this great email from somebody. I have to respond to the person saying that let me see if I can, yeah, here it is. It was in response to, it came on December 15th, and he said, while I have been in numerous NIH in-person reviews over the years, my virtual panel experience is confined to NSF. Based on the latter, I would bet that panel member familiarity with virtual meetings as of 2026 has gotten so deep that virtual panels are probably as good as in-person from the perspective of getting the review business done. What the panelists lose in the benefit of all the sidebars, networking during breaks, et cetera, which build community. And I think it matters in this NIH moment that it takes probably appreciably less lead time and of course less expense and associated processing to schedule virtual meetings with reasonable attendance. So I had a reviewer, and it was an NSF reviewer, but still, I had said something about I think in a newsletter tip about my concern about the quality of review being reduced with the possibility of virtual review. And this person was saying, I don't think that's true anymore. I think that is not a worry. So for whatever that's worth, that's probably less of a concern. But yeah, so that's going to be in effect now until after the July deadlines are done. And then in theory, it should be business as usual going into the cycle 3 deadlines, which are deadlines on or after September 25th. Okay, sorry, I should have included this from NIH. The shutdown requires that NIH cancel over 370, yeah, and 24,000. Yeah, so this is what we were just discussing. The calls for R21, R33 issued by AHRQ, what is usually different that they look for? Like different compared to NIH, there's very little difference if that's what you're asking. R21, R33 is a phased mechanism that's like the R61, R33, but with a smaller budget. That's why you would choose the R21 instead of the R61 piece of it. R61 is for larger budget versions of this, but it's a type of clinical trial planning grant. And when they're issued by AHRQ or NIH, they tend to look very similar. I don't have a lot of information about how review is going at AHRQ right now, so I can't say that. In my experience in general, AHRQ applications are written and reviewed in a very similar way to NIH. So I don't have specific information about that mechanism, although I know how to, I could give you tips on writing that from the NIH perspective, but they should look pretty similar to the NIH and they should be reviewed in a pretty similar way. Okay, let's see. I saw that ECI's I think you mean I'm not sure ESI. You're probably talking about ESI. I saw that ESIs receive bonus points when submitting to an R01, but not an R21. What about an R03? Yeah. So this person's asking about ESI funding advantage. So this is early stage investigator funding advantage. So an early stage investigator is 10 years or less from their terminal degree or their last clinical training if they're a clinician, and they haven't been a PI on an R01 or equivalent. And there is a funding advantage conferred to you. You get that 10-year runway to land your first R01. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with small format Rs. So R21, R03, R34, none of those have anything to do with the ESI funding bump. So you don't get a funding advantage on those other smaller mechanisms, nor do you lose your ESI funding advantage on the R01 if you land one of those. So the ESI funding advantage is specific to the R01 or equivalent mechanisms, but the equivalent is not R03. And the advantage varies tremendously. In some institutes, it's like 1 or 2 percentage points. I think NIA has probably typically been the most generous with their ESI funding advantage. It's sometimes as high as 10 percentage points. They can be super high. So it's not that funding advantage is not typically published anymore. Some institutes would publish that in newsletters or online. They don't seem to really do that anymore. So you could ask your program officer or try to look historically, search for earlier FY years to see what they've typically done in terms of their funding advantage. But on the whole, I think it's really important to map out your submission strategy, working backward off your ESI expiration. And in general, I try to suggest that people submit their third R01 on a single project right before their ESI status expires. And the reason for that is that you can submit an A0, a first R01 submission. If it doesn't get funded, you can resubmit as an A1. And then if that doesn't get funded, you can retool and put it in as a brand new A0 again. And if your ESI status expires right after that, as long as you resubmit within 13 months of that A0, the resubmission, meaning the fourth submission this time, that resubmission will also be considered ESI as long as it's within 13 months of the original of the A0. So anyway, that's just kind of like a little bit about ESI. It definitely does not come into play at all with R03s. So you can just, apply with abandon for the small format Rs, and it's not going to, you won't lose your funding advantage at the R01. And the other thing is that all of the PIs have to have the ESI status in order to get the funding advantage. Is NINDS still funding brain cancer research like gliomas? I don't know. I'm not familiar. There are 27 institutes and centers, and they have each of them, especially the large places like NINDS, NIAID, NCI, have vast funding portfolios. And you could ask. Normally, I would suggest that you go look at an appropriation report. That would be the normal way to figure out whether that's something that they hope to fund. So appropriation reports are prospective planning documents that are written and then pitched orally to Congress, usually in late winter, to get funding for the upcoming federal year that begins on October 1st. NIH was not invited to submit such a report last winter, and therefore there is not one on the website. Normally, those things are readily available as taxpayers. You're allowed to have access to all of that, so they're posted online typically. So, in a typical year, I would suggest that you go look at the report for your institute. But this is an atypical year; there is no report, and so I would ask your program officer if that is a priority in their funding portfolio for FY26. A follow-up, all PIs on an R01 must have ESI status. What about co-investigators? Nope, co-investigators don't have to have the ESI status. So it's just the PI. So if you're doing a multi-PI plan, both, or if there are three of them, all the PIs have to have ESI status. It's one of the reasons why, as a first-time R01 applicant, it's really useful to have a more senior person on your team, kind of helping you learn the ropes of running an R01. But you can't make that person a PI because that senior investigator is not going to have the SI status. So typically, what I suggest is you go in as a solo PI and have that senior mentor like figure as a co-investigator with a relatively high percent effort, but still within the range of a co-investigator and not something that would be typical for a PI. Do you know if NIH will be going through a restructuring process like NSF recently went through? Unclear at this time, but if I were a betting gal, which I'm not, but if I were, I would say no. So there is a report. I link to it in chapter 1 of Master the R series, because I would be remiss if I didn't, where there is a proposed restructuring. I will say that I started interacting with NIH in the late 1980s. That's how long I've been doing this kind of work. And I will say that I lost count of the number of times over the decades some administration has proposed a big restructuring to NIH. And sometimes it gets really serious, and people are like, "Oh my God, it's going to happen," and it's never happened. Um, we are in unprecedented times, so there's always the possibility, but it would be so extraordinarily disruptive and like impossible to pull off that it's really, really like NIH is vastly different than NSF. Like NSF's annual budget, I think, is somewhere around $8 billion a year. NIH's is close to 50 billion. Like it is many times larger than NSF. And to pull off a restructuring of something that large, while not impossible, is not terribly likely. And there doesn't seem to be any appetite for it whatsoever in Congress, such that when the subcommittees in the two houses of Congress made their funding recommendation, they actually proposed a separate appropriation line for each institute, which is like their way of saying we're not handing the money over to NIH for you to distribute as you see fit. We are funding the institutes separately. So there was much made about that in the like science policy write-ups about how wow, Congress is really just has no appetite for this restructuring. So if I were a betting gal, I would say it's not going to happen, but lots of things have happened since last January that I thought would never happen. So who knows? But yeah, it's hard to imagine. Okay, any other questions? We're in the final couple of minutes. You guys are troopers. Just to reiterate, Friday at 11:30, I hope to see some of you at First Fridays for my virtual office hours. That's more, tends to be more intimate. People can speak. We can talk over consulting. And then 2 weeks from today, on January 21st, is another Q&A session for Ask the Grant Writing Expert. And then on February 4th, we're going to do a mini tutorial on the Common Forms, which will hopefully be working by then. And then on February 17th is the launch of boot camp for the June deadlines. So I hope to see some of you there. Thank you so much for coming. As the French would say, courage, hang in there. And I will see some of you on Friday, I hope. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.